So glad you could be here for episode 2 of Christ Revealed. Now today, we're going to hear an interview from J. Warner Wallace.
J. Warner Wallace was a homicide detective, a cold case homicide detective for decades, and also he was an atheist. He decided that he wanted to take his skills as a detective, open up this case on Jesus and the resurrection, and apply that and see where it led him. And I have to tell you that his discerning logic and deliberation, step by step through the process as you experience, as he explains it, is riveting. It reads like a great novel. And at the end, the conclusion is startling, and it's sincere, and it's in some respects explosive. Jay Warner, thanks so much for coming and sitting with us, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Can you give us a bio sketch on you?
Well, I was somebody who never thought I would be sitting and talking to you about things related to Jesus. I was raised up in a place where I didn't really know many Christians, and I wasn't in a Christian family. So I came to this late. I was probably about 35. Mm-hmm. At that time, I was already kind of working as an investigator. I was doing a lot of robbery and a couple of murders we were working at the time. I was working in an undercover team. Mm-hmm. And my wife was somebody who was more interested in church and the things of church, not really knowing what Christianity proposed or what was true or not true, but she kind of felt like, hey, we're raising our kids, and don't you think we should bring them to church? Isn't that what you do when you raise your kids? And I thought, yeah, I'm happy to go, just not going to go as a believer. Mm-hmm. My dad is still in that position today. He would be happy to go, but is not going to go as a believer. And so my first step into a church was really just to make Susie happy. Mm-hmm. And I was more than happy to do that. But the pastor was creative enough to throw Jesus in a way that I could catch him. He said a lot of things that day, but the thing that stands out was that he described Jesus as kind of the foundation for Western civilization, the smartest man who ever lived, mm-hmm. all these profound statements and teachings of Jesus. Kind of countercultural teaching at the time, counterintuitive even today. Mm-hmm. All these things that provoked me to want to know, well, what did he say? Because mm-hmm. you're not going to get all that in one sermon. Right. So I said, you kind of got me interested, and I didn't know where to even look. So I went out and I bought a New Testament, I bought a Bible. I didn't spend a lot of money on it. I didn't really think I would go very far with it. And I really was thinking that the wisdom teaching of Jesus might just be a series of proverbs, mm-hmm. Like fortune cookie Jesus. Right. That's kind of what I was expecting. And it didn't work out that way. I saw that these were couched in the Gospels, these accounts that someone appears to want me to believe actually occurred. They're historical narratives, at least that's the way they're being pitched. Mm-hmm. And so I started thinking, okay, so is this all a kind of a fictional, mythological narrative that teaches a good story? Is it really the remnants of an eyewitness account? Is it truly an eyewitness account from the first century? I just needed to know before I could assess this. And I really wasn't trying to disprove it. My goal was not to, I didn't think it was worth even proving. I thought it was so absurd, patently absurd, that this miracle worker who rose from the dead mm-hmm. Was. So I didn't even think of it aggressively. Right. I just thought it was blatantly and obviously false. So, but when I started to read the Gospels, by this time in my career, I was already working cases where I had several eyewitnesses who would make a claim about something in the past, say 30, 35 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I really finished my career doing nothing but cold case homicides. And that skill set teaches you things. Mm-hmm. And one of the things it'll teach you is how to assess eyewitnesses. Is this really an eyewitness account? Can I really trust this as an eyewitness account? And what about the statement is reliable or not reliable? What are the techniques we use to determine if something is reliable? And I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to test and use the skill set that I had, right? And they're off to the races. As a matter of fact, I think within about 6 months of really tearing through, I still have that first Bible. It was like a forensic statement analysis is what I was using. It's a process we use, right? And determined. I thought, I told Susie, as much as I hate to admit it, this feels and has the texture of reliable eyewitness accounts. And mm-hmm. so, what do we do? What if this crazy idea, this crazy story right. is actually true? And I'm measuring this in every way that I knew to measure it. And I was becoming comfortable mm-hmm. with the reliable nature of the accounts. And then you're stuck with this guy who rose from the grave. So I had to make a decision.
Yeah, so basically, so you had many years, I guess, of experience in police work, and you, at this point in your life, you're a detective, and you're working cases, and like you said, cold cases. So that means they're somewhat historic.
Yes.
Maybe not a couple thousand years historic,
right.
but they're...
Well, here's how that's going to unwraps. I mean, if you think about the nature of my cases, I get a case where someone is interviewed 30 years ago about what they said they saw.
Right.
That person sometimes will pass away before I can even get to the case.
Right.
Well, so you can go to the detective, right? Well, he's written a report, but guess what? Sometimes those detectives have also passed away. There's a good chance they were even older than the witness they were interviewing. So now I'm stuck with the report of something that occurred in the past, according to some eyewitness.
Right.
And I don't have access to the eyewitness or to the report writer.
Right.
Well, what am I looking at in the Gospels? I've got an account of something that allegedly happened in the distant past. I have no access to the alleged eyewitness or the report writer. So I'm really, it's the same process, it's the same skill set you're going to apply. That's where I found myself. And I really didn't think of it that way. I didn't think of it, wow, I'm in a unique position to be, I just thought, well, how else would you assess this? I mean, how would anyone know if this is true? And I only knew one way to do it, and so that's how I approached it.
So you seem to have taken, at least in one aspect, a special interest in the resurrection.
Right.
And really digging in deep
That's right.
there. And so with that, can you walk us through the actual process you went through?
Right.
And sort of give us the little bit of the narrative, the personal narrative, as far as psychologically what's going on, because you said you approached this as, in the beginning as thinking this is an absurd thing.
Right.
Now you got my curiosity, I got some interest here, and I have a particular set of skills, and why shouldn't I apply them here if I'm applying them out in the rest of the world with what I do?
Yeah, this is the centerpiece, I think. The entire philosophical, historical system, the claims themselves hinge on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, I didn't even get to the point where I was reading Paul's letters to hear him say something similar in 1 Corinthians, but I knew just from my own perspective, it's all going to come down to this. Because if you're an ancient wise sage, and by the time I read the Gospels, I had read other ancient wise sages, but none of them made a claim to die and come back from the grave. So this puts Jesus in a separate category, and I knew that was going to be a deal killer for me, probably, you know, because I was a philosophical naturalist. There was no way I was going to accept something that's this supernatural. So I had to approach it in two ways. Number one, what is it that we would typically say verifies that an account is reliable? And typically that's built on a number of questions that we would allow jurors on a criminal trial to think about when they're assessing eyewitnesses on the stand. We actually have jury instructions that will help jurors assess the reliability of eyewitnesses. But they are, there's a bunch of them, you know, about 13, 14 different instructions and questions they could ask. They all come down to four broad categories. Number one, was the person who's making this claim really there to see what it is they said they saw? Because someone could lie. If you discover he's not even there on that day, you're gonna, that witness is going to be off the table. Two, is there a way that we could corroborate or verify, knowing that we're not going to have necessarily a recording, we're not necessarily going to have a video of every account, but if he says he leaned over the counter to do the robbery, and that's what you're telling me, and then I find his palm print on the counter, well, that one little piece will help corroborate your story, even though it says nothing about all the other things you described. What did he say? Was he holding a gun? That palm print's not going to tell me that, but we know that that one little piece will corroborate the eyewitness account. So I'm looking for those kinds of things. Three, we're looking to see, well, has he changed his story? I mean, is he honest and accurate? And has he been honest and accurate over time? Anyone who's changing their story over time is probably not telling you the truth.
So consistency.
Yeah, consistency. And then finally, bias. We're looking for, hey, what is it would motivate this guy to lie to me? Now, if you find a guy who's got bias, good reason to lie, motive to lie to you, it doesn't mean he's necessarily lying to you. So it really isn't, it's a cumulative case. You build it this way. And so as I looked at those four areas, with the Gospels, I realized that, man, in every way you could test an eyewitness account, and in every way that I had tested eyewitness accounts, these seem to pass the test. But here's the problem. They include miraculous events. And that's where I, for the most part, was, you know, I would have said, okay, there's some truth in this, and there's some fiction. And so it really was a matter of my asking myself, well, why would I separate these two categories? You know, why do I think that this event could never have happened? He didn't feed 5,000. He didn't walk on water. I mean, come on. He might have been on the boat, but that part is not true. Well, why am I saying that? Well, because I would reject out of hand, to begin with, I had a presuppositional bias against anything miraculous. So at some point, what got me over the hump was having to test my biases. Why do I believe there's no way? Why do I believe that everything that in the universe I can account for with just the stuff of the universe? Right. I would have said, hey, if you can't get it with space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, you can't get it. So these events, there's no way that could have happened, because this would require something supra or extra natural to occur. And I just denied the existence of those kinds of things. So I had to eventually address that issue.
So when you did address it, what path did that open up for you?
Well, I started to ask myself as an atheist, hey, are there some things that I believe are true or exist that are extra natural? I was a guy who loved thinking about cosmology, and all of us grew up in the Star Trek generation. We were always thinking about space travel and time and all these different issues. And so I was always somebody who believed in the standard cosmological model, this idea that everything in the universe, all space, time, matter, comes into existence from nothing. And when we say nothing, we don't mean space, time, or matter. Space is not nothing, space is something.
Right.
So we're stuck with either redefining the term nothing or having to account for some first cause that is not spatial, temporal, or material.
Right.
Now, if that first cause is also personal, in other words, if it's not an impersonal force, it's a personal being, that's still an option, even I think in Big Bang cosmology. So, I always think that this is still a credible, reasonable option for us. And if there is a being that's powerful enough to blink everything into existence, all space, time, and matter, I'm betting that being could probably walk on water. So I think what that did for me is it said, look, I really am focusing on what would be much smaller miraculous activity, much less miraculous than the beginning of the universe. That would be the Genesis 1 would be the penultimate miracle in all of Scripture, given the way we're thinking here. And if that could happen, if there's a personal being that could accomplish that, then I think you've got to at least consider the reasonableness of all the lesser miracles that you see in the New Testament. So that at least kind of put them in play for me. In the end, though, the question is, were these accounts, how do we account for the accounts if they're lies?
Right.
Or do they imagine them? So I think it's about any criminal investigation. We're looking at all possible explanations when we first begin. And we basically eliminate those explanations that are either impossible based on evidence or less reasonable based on evidence. And this is what we do in every crime scene, in every criminal investigation, in front of every jury. The jury's going to do the same thing. You're going to get a proposal from the prosecuting team and then another alternative explanation from the defense team. And they're going to have to decide which of these two explanations is most reasonable in light of the evidence. That is a process that's actually known as abductive reasoning. And so I just applied this to, okay, we've got this claim about Jesus rising from the grave. We've got some bare, minimal pieces of evidence that I think we have to account for. It certainly emerges pretty quickly, this idea about the resurrection. We've got what appears to be an empty tomb and no body available. I think that's a reasonable conclusion, given the fact that you could end this entire story in the first century by simply taking the body of Jesus and displaying it. It'd be over. And that never happened. But you could explain that, though, a number of ways. Doesn't mean the resurrection occurred. But you have to explain it.
Right.
We've also got to account for the eyewitnesses who never recanted during any of this time in the first century. Clearly, the second way to get this to go away quickly, if you're opposed to Christianity, is if you don't show the body of Jesus, well, at least get those people who said they saw him alive to recant. And we see this in the second, third, fourth generation of Christians, people who weren't eyewitnesses, but they were trusting the testimony of eyewitnesses. Right. Some of those people were tortured. And we have people reporting back to the emperor that they successfully got some of these people to recant. But you have absolute historical silence about the eyewitnesses ever recanting. I can see why somebody who didn't know if it was true or not and was just trusting somebody else's story might want to recant the story under pressure.
Right.
But the eyewitnesses, we have a collection of martyrdom stories, and even if we don't know that all of those martyrdom stories are necessarily reliable, We do know that we have no record of anyone ever recanting. They went to their graves with this claim. And so the question we have to ask is, well, does that make it true? No. Again, there's ways to explain that.
Right.
So we're looking at a few facts: the empty tomb, the transformation of the disciples, the fact they never recanted their story. There are a number of simple facts I kind of started to assemble.
And they had motive to recant, which is interesting, right? If they're being tortured,
they're being tortured,
etc.
right? And
So
the question is, what's their motive to look? Motive comes down to three things. There are only three reasons why anyone commits a murder. I learned this years ago, and it's also the same three reasons why anyone steals something, or commits another kind of crime, or lies about anything, or anything you've ever done wrong in your life. You only did it for one of three reasons, because there's only three motives behind bad behavior. And once you know those three motives, it makes it easier to work a homicide. Because I'm not walking into death scenes and going, oh my gosh, there's 1,000 reasons why someone could kill this woman. No, there are only three reasons. You find me somebody in one of those categories and we're good to go. So a lot of what we're doing is not, to kind of blend a metaphor, it's not rocket surgery. It's really straightforward.
Right.
So it turns out it's pursuit of money,
right.
sex or relationships, and power. Those three things will motivate people to do things they ought not do. And if you're suggesting a conspiracy came together of a large number of people, well, they've all got to have something in one of those three areas. And that's where I found this to be really compelling, in the sense that I could not find motive. So I look at all the ways I could explain the basic facts, right? I think there are like 7 ways to do this. Either the Gospels are true, that's one way to explain it. That's the Christian way to explain it. Right. But I might suggest, well, no, they're lying, or they're hallucinating. Or, he didn't really die on the cross. He was badly beaten, he went unconscious, but it's a resuscitation, not a resurrection. Right. Or an imposter sat in for him. Or this is a late legend of an early version of Jesus that was, twisted over the years until it became the supernatural. There's a number of ways to explain this without affirming the Christian explanation. And as an atheist, I held one or two of those other 6 explanations. Different ways, alternative ways to explain the minimal facts that we have to explain about this event called the resurrection. Well, look, I asked juries, look through your list of evidences, examine the evidence, compare that evidence to the explanations, and you tell me which is the most reasonable explanation in light of the evidence. So I found myself asking the same question. Okay, here's the evidence. Look through these 6 or 7 explanations. You tell me which is the most. Now remember, every explanation has a strength and has weaknesses. Everyone does, even when you have the truth. Cases in which we've convicted guys who confessed later, our cases had weaknesses in certain areas. We just pushed through. So even when you have the truth, it's going to have something that's going to seem confusing. It always does. So I would say, okay, all of those explanations, I think they all have deal killers. I don't think this is a lie. I think he really did die on the cross. I can go through all that with you, but to be honest, I went through all 6 and got to the last one, which is the Christian explanation. And I said, wow, the Christian explanation does account for the basic facts best. Everything makes sense if it just happened the way it was written.
Right.
But it has a deal killer for me, a flaw. I thought it was a fatal flaw at the time, and that is that it requires a resurrection. Now, it turns out I have to ask myself, okay, well, what am I really investigating here? I'm investigating whether or not a supernatural event like the resurrection could ever be a reasonable explanation. But I would have said, no, I don't believe in the supernatural. But I'm starting off then with the conclusion when that's the very thing I'm supposed to be investigating.
Right.
So I said, okay, let's at least suspend your doubt for a second. Let's take a look and compare all these explanations. Every one of those has 3 or 4 problems. This one has 1 problem, and guess what it is? It's my presuppositional bias against the supernatural. In other words, I could remove it. The only thing that's keeping me from it was my presupposition against the supernatural. Now look, when it comes to conspiracy theories, I can tell you 5 or 6 reasons why that just did not happen that way, because I've worked conspiracies. I know how hard they are to pull them off. But when it came to this side, the Christian explanation, it doesn't have any of those kinds of fatal flaws. The only flaw it has is that I don't like supernatural explanations. So it turns out, when I looked at my collection of explanations here, the one that had the least problems was the Christian explanation, and the only problems it had were me. My bias against the possibilities of anything supernatural. So I knew it was time for me to be really honest. And that's really when I started to ask, well, can I explain everything in the universe with my naturalistic approach? Can I explain, simple things like consciousness, free agency? Can I explain the appearance of fine-tuning in the universe? Can I explain the origin of the universe? Can I explain the appearance of design in biology? Can I explain the beginning of life? Can I explain objective, transcendent moral truths? Can I explain this incredible standard of good by which we call anything evil? I think those are the things that I had to try to explain, given my naturalistic perspective. And it turns out, really, to be honest, the best explanations for those things are also something supernatural. So in the end, it was this cumulative case that started to weigh on me. And I realized that the resurrection really is only out of bounds for me because I chose it to be out of bounds. And if I simply lay that bias down, the New Testament began to open up to me.
Are there cases in general that, because of a detective's bias, it starts with a premise that there's a commitment to, and as a result, they're going enthusiastically in the wrong direction, and they never get solved?
Oh, absolutely. That's my casework. Yeah. So my casework is filled with unsolved cases. That's what murders are. Cold cases are only murders. There's no statute of limitations on a murder. So all of my cases are cases that, for one reason or another, didn't get solved. And sometimes it's that the detectives spend a year chasing something they were so sure of, just to have that not be the case, and then they're a year behind it. And if you're a year behind a murder, it's really hard, right, to kind of pick up the pieces. Yeah. Or they had someone in sight, the right person in mind. They knew who actually did it, but for whatever reason, they couldn't make the case evidentially. So you're absolutely right. I've been on scene at murders where the first intuition of a partner was wrong.
Right.
And where we had to really kind of work. Now, we were gracious because that was a senior partner. So we listened to him, and we chased it as far as we could. And then all of us were then shocked when we discovered who the real killer was. Because, to be honest, in that particular case, none of us saw that coming. So I get it, but you cannot, the biggest tool I try to teach people when they work investigations, the first tool I'll teach any rookie, the first tool I'll teach any audience, is this simple skill of don't be a know-it-all, of don't think you know the answer before you start. That's the surest way to waste time or close a case or suspend a case without being able to close it because you chased the wrong thing for too long.
How long was the period of time between when you first started to go on this journey, looking at the resurrection, and then came to your conclusion?
Well, I can't even say I really came to a conclusion. I think I spent probably 6 months or so in Scripture every day for hours. I was obsessed because I started to get interested in little nitpicky things. Word
But you're not reading them spiritually at the time. You're reading them factually.
I wouldn't even know what spiritually we meant, right? I just knew that I had this book, and I did some research to see how it was transmitted through time. I wanted to know what the original languages were, so I wanted to make sure I knew what my limits were. I didn't speak Greek or Hebrew, so I knew I had limits in those areas. I did my best to kind of to get some resources to help me do that, and tried to do that as best I could. And then I started to dig in, just to really look at word selection, to look at, I understand how witnesses report things and why witness testimony never, ever matches. You'll never work a case in which two witnesses will say precisely the same thing about anything. And it doesn't mean anyone's unreliable. It doesn't mean that anyone's lying.
Right.
It just means that we bring our entire life's package to the table when we look at something, when we see something.
As a matter of fact, if you have two witnesses that perfectly match, that's
right.
almost a red flag.
Well, the only thing I talk about when I get a call in the middle of the night and someone has been killed in our city, they're going to give me a location and they're going to say, hey, there's an officer there, usually a sergeant at a command post, who's waiting for you. I only have one really instruction from my house when I'm on the phone, and then I'll typically say, okay, so officers are there, right? Are the officers with the witnesses? Yes. Have them separate the witnesses and stay with the witnesses until I get there. So the separation of witnesses is really important to me because if you don't separate them, you will get there and get one story from all 5 guys or gals. You'll get one story because they've had an hour to sit around and compare notes and think, okay, maybe he's right, maybe she's right, and now they kind of merge. No. Don't worry about what might be appear to be contradictory. Because in the end, it's not going to be. I need you to give me the varied accounts. I want all 5. They are not going to be perfect. They're going to puzzle together in a certain way. The question that you didn't answer, somebody else is going to answer. The question that you raised, because you don't understand why it happened that way, don't worry, another witness is going to give me a piece of the puzzle. I'll be able to answer that. Now, the witnesses may never know how I puzzled it back together, because I don't want them to even know that before they go to trial. I don't want them to ever know what the other person said, because I want their statement to be clean.
Right.
But what you see if you do this over a period of time is that, yeah, witnesses never agree. It could happen right now. Someone could run in here right now and do something to me, and I could ask all of us in this room, what happened, and I would get different stories. And I've done it in front of groups. I can't get people to agree on the sex of the perpetrator.
Wow.
So this happens.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anyone's lying.
Right.
And in the end, our job is to be able to piece back together. Now, I also think if you had accounts that were early, and we have good reason to believe that these accounts were circulating simultaneously at the same time, early in history, okay, well then why doesn't somebody correct the obvious contradictions? It'd be easy enough if you could just say, take that out, because in the future someone's going to think. No, all the kind of warts and bumps that you might think are ugly, are embarrassing, they're still in the accounts. And that is typically what I see when I get an old case book and I open it up, and I've got 4 witnesses who were interviewed back in the day, and there's some things in that account that I can just see up front. Oh, a defense attorney is going to have a great day with this, because he said this and she said that, and these don't match, and he's going to try to convince a jury that you can't trust anyone here. Now, what we'll have to do is come in and say, this is the nature of eyewitnesses, and let me show you how these things come back together. Let me show you some physical evidence that corroborates the narrative, and off we go. The same thing can occur with the New Testament.
So what you're saying is, in reality, when this Bible was being assembled, the New Testament is being assembled, they could have scrubbed it.
Oh, sure.
And kind of basically adulterated, changed varying accounts so they would line up better. So it's almost the fact that they do have departures. What you're saying in your mind as a detective, the implication drawn is that they left it alone.
And there were early Christians in history, Tatian is one, that really made an effort to kind of harmonize the accounts, right? There's like this impulse that we have. Well, it's interesting that no one's doing that immediately, that these 4 accounts are bringing to a slightly nuanced variations between the accounts, which were with. So I never flinched as a detective who was an atheist, reading it for the first time. Like, I didn't focus on the differences and go, oh, this is junk. No, in fact, the differences were what kept me reading, because the variations I was seeing were within the range I would expect if these were really eyewitnesses. And as a matter of fact, another thing was happening as I was reading through the Gospels. I call this unintentional eyewitness support. Now, I discovered years later that there's been some work on this, but I didn't know this at the time. I just knew that when I interview eyewitnesses, it's not unusual to have one say something and you're going, okay, that makes no sense. And they'll even say to you, okay, I don't care if I know it doesn't make any sense, but I'm telling you, that's what I saw. And you're like going, okay. So they have this weird account that some witness has given you. It's all good except for one little piece. You're like, well, it doesn't make any sense. Well, then, a year later, or maybe the same day, as you're interviewing other witnesses, somebody gives you a fact that now, okay, now that makes sense. This guy didn't even know why it made sense, but now because this guy saw it from a different angle and he provides that missing piece, now it makes sense. Well, I was seeing this in the Gospels over and over again, where people would say something, a writer would say something, and it makes no sense. There's one of these in the Gospels where Jesus is standing in front of Caiaphas in a trial, right before he's about to be crucified. And the writer says that he is struck by people who are challenging him, and they're saying, hey, if you think you're God, prophesy, tell us who hit you. And I'm thinking, if all you had was that one account, this would make no sense. Right. Because clearly, if you just hit me, I could tell you who hit me. Why would that be so remarkable? Why would that even be proof of my deity? Because it's not that account, but it's another account that walks through the steps and mentions in the other account that he's being blindfolded just prior to this. Now, this account never mentioned it. So that is one of those kind of unintentional eyewitness support that comes in and fills in a detail that is left hanging. These have been recently, or in the last 100 years or so, have been called the undesigned coincidences of Scripture. And I was familiar with this term later, but I'll tell you, as I was looking through it as an investigator, I was encouraged by the variations I was seeing and the fact that the variations puzzled together the way I would expect them to puzzle together. And that gave me at least the confidence to go another step, right? Do another test, another week reading through Scripture. And I was so obsessed with it that I was sitting in one of the rooms of my house that was empty at the time, and I would just get up every morning. I didn't want to wake anybody up, but I would go in there and I would read through. And forensic statement analysis is a process we use with people in custody when we ask them, what did you do yesterday? That's the day of the murder. Really? Okay, do me a favor. Write down on this piece of paper everything you did from the time you got up in the morning to the time you went to bed. You can only use the front side of the paper. Now that front side happens to have 24 lines. And you can only use this pen. And they would fill that in. Well, now you have to make decisions. If it's a 12-hour day you're up, you've got to account for 12 hours in 24 lines. Now, if you did this evenly, you'd have 2 lines per hour. But people don't do it that way. They expand or compress time for a number of different reasons. Well, we're looking at that, expansion and compression of time. We're looking at the use of pronouns. Why do they use certain names for certain people? We're looking at all the optional words, words you don't need to use, every adjective, every adverb. You don't need to use those kinds of words. When you put those words in, I know you're selecting from a palette of options. That tells me something about you. So I'm looking at these kinds of variables. And I had heard, in some of the early months of doing this, that Mark's account was allegedly written at the feet of Peter in Rome. Mark is not an eyewitness. He is writing the account of the eyewitness in Rome according to an ancient bishop named Papias. So I said, okay, that's an interesting claim. It is a short account. It's very brief. And it doesn't feel like it's as kind of heel-to-toe robust. It feels like it could be a series of talks, that have been seamed together. So I said, I could use forensic statement analysis, I bet, and just see if Peter's fingerprints are in that account. Is there something about the account that really makes more sense if Peter is the source for Mark? And so that first 6 months, a lot of that was me in my extra room, getting up every day, not knowing anything about the narrative, anything about biblical history, but just going through Mark's account using a forensic statement analysis. And everything you examine, if it's compression of time, that's one color pen. If it's pronouns, that's another color pen. If it's adjectives and adverbs, that's another color pen. If it's deception indicators, that's another kind of pen.
And you're applying these pens and colors right through the whole.
Okay. It's just, and so I still have that Bible. It's filled with my notes. And every time I discovered something that I thought, I got to come back to this because this seems to be, it would involve Peter, or maybe it wouldn't involve Peter, I would put a little P next to it. So I'd say, this is something that if I'm making a case to anyone in the future. Well, when I got done with that, I was very comfortable with Papias's claim, historic claim, that Mark's account was the scribed eyewitness account of Peter. And it's just another one of the pieces that I was assembling to look at whether or not those accounts were reliable. But look, in the end, the deal is this. You can believe that those accounts are reliable and are telling you something true about Jesus, and you won't have belief in. You would just have belief that.
Right.
You would know that these accounts are telling you something that you could trust about Jesus. Doesn't mean you would trust him. Doesn't mean you become a Christian. And I was not a Christian at that point. I was just somebody who was becoming very comfortable with the reliability of Scripture.
Now, with the people around you who see you throwing yourself all in on this and going through a Bible and marking it up this way, what are they saying to you while you're doing this?
Well, so my wife was really, I think, encouraged. She wasn't a Christian herself either, but I think she was really thinking, if this is true, I'd like to have my husband be in on it with me, So she was, I think, more encouraged. But she's always been, we were together 18 years. Neither one of us were a Christian at that time. So it's not as though I had ever even really felt any pressure at all from her, because she wasn't a Christian either. I think she was just more interested in God than I was. But my partners, they started to notice. So surveillance teams are very tight. There are 5 officers and a sergeant. We're in cars every day, and we're following bad guys all around Los Angeles County.
Right. And
they don't know we're following them because we think they've done a crime in our city, but we're not quite sure. Or they did it with somebody else. We don't know who the second person is. So we're just watching them long enough to identify them and get all this done, right? So we get to be very tight. You work long hours together, and you're always watching somebody. And if you're not on the eye watching the bad guy, you're on a perimeter waiting for the bad guy to go mobile. Right. So whenever I was on the perimeter, I was studying. And I was pretty close to being a Christian by the time a partner of mine caught me. And I remember I was backed up in my surveillance car in a terrible neighborhood, but I was in a funeral home. Usually funeral home parking lots are safe places to park your car and sit, right? So I'm backed up into a space, and I'm so engrossed in what I'm doing that I commit the biggest sin of any surveillance officer. I don't see him walk up on me. Because you got to be situational awareness. You have to know where you are, and you can't let guys walk up. You know, that's how you get shot. So I was so entrenched, right, that I didn't hear him walk up. His name was Steve, and he walks up and gets behind me, and he sees I got a Bible and I've got some other materials on the seat next to me, and he says, "I knew it. I knew there was something different about you. Oh, don't tell me you're a Christian now." Because for years together, we had maligned Christians. We arrest a lot of Christians, okay? And we just would mock these guys, okay? We did this so much that everyone knew I was probably the most outspoken non-Christian on our team. And now here he catches me with this Bible on my lap, right? He says, "Oh, I know how you are," because he knew how adamantly opposed to Christianity I was. He says, I'll bet you being a pastor, because I know you. You're either all the way you hate it, or you're all the way in. And sure enough, he was right. It took several years for that to happen, but he it was I kind of ate my words for probably the rest of my career at that point. So and I've got people who eventually promoted to become my chief, my captains, my lieutenants. I stayed as a detective working these cases, and these guys knew me when I was a very committed atheist. Right. And they still. I just saw some yesterday. They went to an event at our agency. And sure enough, these guys are still saying, "Yeah, so you still preaching?" Because they think it's such a joke that I went from one extreme to the other. So yeah, I had to take a little bit of abuse. That's okay.
Yeah, well, it's a great story, because I think it's one thing to say what kind of what your findings are. It's another thing to say what the experience is as you're having the findings.
And cops are so. At least I think we have a tendency to be so analytical about things that we never trust experiences. And you'll talk to witnesses who will try to ground what they're telling you based on an experience or based on how they felt about it. And that's so unreliable. And so we're always like, just the facts. If you've ever watched the old TV shows, just the facts, ma'am. So I think we are that way by nature. And so I was the kind of person who would have resisted any impulse to feel my way into this. I would have just resisted it. And I knew that if I was going to become a Christian, that I would be challenged by the other evidence case makers that I knew in my agency, that for years had watched me kind of belittle. Most of the Christians we met could not make a case for what they believed. And even the few officers we knew who were Christians could not make a case for what they believed.
Well, this is the other very fascinating point. You didn't get there, you didn't become a Christian by taking a leap of faith.
Right.
You took an intellectual path
that
led you there, which is counterintuitive to what you probably would have believed is the way that people find it.
Yeah, I think the word faith is loaded, right? I mean, it's defined in a certain way by culture, and if you aren't careful, you don't realize that definition that people typically think of a faith is not a biblical definition of faith. So what I try to say to people is, look, every case you make for a jury has unanswered questions, and we actually even ask jurors before we start. We'll say, "Hey, are you the kind of person who needs every question answered before you can make a decision?" If you are, we're going to excuse you. You're not going to be on our jury panel because we're not going to be able to answer. We already tell you in advance that you're going to have open questions. This is the nature of every criminal trial. No one ever has the perfect evidence set that answers every possible question. So what we ask people to do is to make an informed decision, even though they're going to have to step across a gap of unanswered questions. Now we hope to make that gap as small as possible and make you as comfortable as possible stepping across it, but we know we're going to ask you to take a step of evidential trust. Now you might describe that as a step of faith, but it's not a blind faith and it's not an unreasonable faith. It's what I would call a forensic faith. It's the idea here is that it is a faith that is grounded in an evidence trail that will never get you all the way there, but it'll get you close. You'll go in the right direction, and you're going to take a step across your unanswered questions. But a blind faith is one where you say, how can I? So, for example, an unreasonable belief is one that is you hold in spite of evidence to the contrary. So you might think, for example, you get warts from frogs. Okay, you don't get warts from frogs. We already know what the science is behind this. We know that it doesn't happen that way. So if you hold that belief, you're holding it in spite of evidence to the contrary. That's an unreasonable belief. I don't believe that Christianity is that kind of belief. It's not. There is no evidence to the contrary that you can point out that says this is unreasonable. But you could say, well, yeah, but I think that faith is blind in the sense that isn't faith the thing you do when you don't have evidence? Isn't faith, well, that doesn't appear to be how Jesus saw it, because Jesus never operated that way. He continually said, hey, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, at least believe the evidence of these miracles I worked in front of you. And when he always relied on evidence then when he had a doubt. So when John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus, hey, John sent us, he's in custody, he wants to know, are you the one? I get it, John's suffering, he's not sure now what's going on, he's got questions, he sends his disciples. Well, I think Jesus right then could have scolded John. Because John is his cousin, raised by parents who knew each other. His mom knew Jesus' mom. But he doesn't do any of that. Instead, he works 3 miracles in front of John's disciples, says, go back and tell John what you just saw. That is an evidential approach, right? Because you could say, hey, you need to trust. You need to pray about it. You need to remember how you were raised. No, it doesn't do any of that. He says, okay, I'll give you a little more proof. Off you go. So I think that's really, it was valuable to me as a guy who was investigating this as somebody who loves evidence, that Jesus seemed to love evidence too. And that kind of faith is neither blind nor unreasonable. It's that, yes, he gets it. You're going to have some unanswered questions. You may have some doubts, but you've got more than enough good evidence to point you in this direction, and that little step you're going to take of trust is not unwarranted.
What do you think are some of the biggest problems for the resurrection as you're putting the case together, and you've laid out how you kind of got to your conclusions? But what do you think are some of the problems that exist? Because, like you said, it can't. We don't have a videotape account of it. So when you are dealing with people who are still trying to push back on your own conclusions, what are some of the biggest challenges there?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that people would say they can't trust the Gospels for any number of reasons. Now, if they're saying they can't trust the Gospels because they include miracles, well, then that's going to be a tough one to kind of counter, because that's a presuppositional bias against the supernatural, and that's not something that, it's a presuppositional bias. You're going to have to at least be honest with yourself and suspend it for a season. While you look at this. And if you can't suspend it, at least understand it's a heart issue, not a head issue. This is something that you just can't let go of, and you have to kind of remember that.
And with that, though, I mean, because there's so many other pieces of cooperation between the Gospels. So that would be.
Well, let's put it this way: people would say, "Well, how can I trust that this thing's been transmitted properly?" I think the best and the most powerful objection I've heard on this is from Bart Ehrman, right? Bart is a guy who is a scholar and seems to be actually a very winsome guy as well, so I can understand why people would actually like to read his books. I've read his books. He was a Christian, raised in the church, first shaken, he says in a book called Jesus Interrupted, at Moody Bible Institute. So he's at a Christian university in the first class in textual criticism and Bible. And he is told, and he had never heard this until that point, he is told that we don't have a single original copy, original autograph of any New Testament book. So if you, for example, were curious, well, I'm not quite sure the Constitution of the United States actually says that, well, you could actually go back and see the original Constitution under glass, and you could see what it really said. We can't do that with the New Testament. Not any book from the New Testament, not any letter. He also said, to make it matters worse, we don't have the first copy of the original. We don't have the copy of the copy of the copy of the first copy of the original. The earliest copy we have in many cases is late in history, 3rd, 4th century. And the most ancient copies we have of some of these books, some of these letters, some of these Gospels, when you compare them to one another, they have thousands of small variations. He says more variations than there are words in the New Testament. That's, I think, powerful. It was powerful for me. What it all comes down to is I needed to know, even if I could date the Gospels early, and I think we can, how do we know what those Gospels said? How do we know that the Jesus that was written about in the earliest days wasn't changed dramatically over time? Until finally the version we have today, as in a book that Bart wrote, Jesus becomes God because he has been transformed from the wise sage who never worked miracles, was never born of a virgin, never died on a cross and rose from the dead. All of these things have been added to the story until finally we have the Christ of Christianity. Now that was something that was troubling for me, and I needed to know. But I think my casework was helpful in that sense, because I know this is a claim that's often made by defense attorneys about pieces of evidence we bring in a trial. Oh, you have this piece of evidence you found at the crime scene. Really? And you think there's a mark on that piece of evidence that demonstrates it belongs to the defendant's gun. Oh, really? Well, it's 30 years now. How do I know that the one you're showing me today is the same piece of evidence from the crime scene. I mean, for all I know, you pulled it out of property 20 years later and you etched in that little mark that you're now saying is so definitive, and it was never part of the original, and now you're trying to make a case against my defendant when in fact that's been altered evidence. Okay, same claim. We have an original that's different from the version we have today because someone made a change along the way. So what we typically ask is, okay, well, how about this? There's an officer who was at the crime scene back in 1980 when that thing was collected, and when he took the collection, he wrote a report describing that little mark, that it was really there back then. Maybe he even took a Polaroid. Now he gives it to the next guy, maybe the property room. They make a description of the same piece of property, and they also mentioned that little mark. I bring it to the, someone brings it to the crime lab years later. They take they also mention the mark. I take it from the crime lab. I write a report. It also mentions the mark. So now I have report after report after report of this thing over time, in which the mark is described. I know it hasn't changed. Each of us is like a link in the chain that brings it from the past to the present. We call this the chain of custody. Right. Who has been handling the evidence over time? Well, it turns out there's chains of custody for the New Testament. So John, for example, he writes something, but I'm not sure. I mean, did he really write what we have today? Well, we could test it because he had 3 students that he gave it to. And they wrote letters to local congregations describing what he said. They also had a student named Irenaeus. Irenaeus wrote what his teachers said. That was Ignatius of Polycarp. Then Irenaeus has got a student, Hippolytus. Now we can go through all the links in the chain of custody to see if the story of Jesus is changing. And as I did that, I realized it never changes. Everything from the miraculous virgin birth, to all the miracles, to the resurrection, to the ascension into heaven, to the Orthodox Christian doctrines of deity of Christ, all these things are not late additions. The very first links we have in this chain of custody, those elements are present. So look, in the end, I might not like what I'm reading about Jesus, but you can't claim that that was added later, because it wasn't added later. It's the first story. It's early in history, which, by the way, makes it hard to lie. If you're going to lie after when everyone's dead. Right. That's a good way to lie. Or lie out of the region. If it's early in the region, much harder. We have early in the region accounts that never change. So I just knew that every way you look at this, and every objection that I could level against it, all in the end came down to either I don't like miracles, or I don't want there to be a God, because I have been God all this time. And I don't really want anyone else to take my place. And it really comes down to those two. And so again, was it rational? I mean, I always would have voiced these as rational objections, or were they really deep-seated volitional objections that I simply didn't want this to be true? And so I had to ask those kinds of tough questions, because every way you could test it, it's going to pass that test. And then you're just stuck with what might be the underlying reason why we're denying this. Now, people can also point to other things they don't like about Scripture. But I tried to walk through each and every one of those objections because I held those myself. Right. This wasn't an effort for me to be a good apologist. This was an effort for me to say, were these objections valid? So sometimes when you're working this kind of a thing, you really are concerned about details, the minutia, right? And as you're kind of assessing explanations for any piece of evidence, you have to be as detailed as you can. For no other reason, you know that the defense team is going to come in, and they're going to, with the microscope, go through all these details. So for no other reason, if you are already convinced, for example, that this is not applicable to you, or this is not a good explanation, you still owe it to yourself to go to all the length of it, because you know at some point in front of a jury, you're going to have to go through all that detail. Right. So I always want to go as far as I can before I stop. And that's why I think it took so long for me to look at, if for no other reason, the resurrection was so key that I didn't want to make a false step, especially with cops who were watching me, who were already kind of going to be needling me. Now, that's why I kept it quiet for so long. I didn't want them to know I was in this kind of investigation, because until I knew I was in, there's no point in them knowing I'm even looking, okay? So I didn't say anything about it to them, but I didn't need to kind of go through those explanations in detail, and I think there's, as I say, there's about 6 that I would have held some combination, because in the end it can't be a resurrection. Jesus could not have come out of the grave. There's got to be another way to explain it. Right. Maybe he never was really in the grave in the sense that he was never really dead. And I know that the people had, at the time I was kind of pursuing this, I had read a few things that made me, I was reading through the Gospels themselves. Look at it. in the Gospels, you recognize he's crucified along with two other people, thieves.
Right.
Now, they're on the cross for a short period of time. Surprisingly short, if everyone, as a matter of fact, when the guards came by to take the bodies off the cross before the Sabbath, the two thieves weren't dead. They had to break their legs to make sure they couldn't push up to breathe and they would die quicker. So you're saying of the three people, two of them aren't dead. Why would you think the third one is? Why would you think that Jesus, the scripture even seems to affirm the idea that two out of the three, probably all three aren't dead. Now he might look bad, he might pass out, he might even look like he's dead. But that would mean he's not really coming back from death, he's just coming back from a bad beating.
Right.
And that might make more sense. So I needed to kind of know, is this a way to account for this? And my experience working with dead bodies was helpful, because I think most of us in the 21st century don't really have a lot of contact with death. We might watch it on movies. We might think we know what it looks like based on what we see on movies or on television, but it doesn't look that way. And I can tell you that actors who are laying still are different than dead people. And if you've ever worked with dead people, you know this is true. If you're a first responder, if you're in the medical industry, if you're working at a funeral home, you spot death from across the room and you recognize it, especially if you're looking at death all the time.
Right.
But in this generation, if your grandmother dies, you're not going to pick her up and take her to the funeral home. You're going to call the funeral home. They're going to come and get her. You don't have to touch her. If she dies suspiciously, you can call the coroner's office. Right. Either way, you're not going to be handling dead people the way everyone did in the first century, because there weren't any funeral homes to call. There weren't any coroner's offices to call. Now we've got a whole generation of people who are familiar with childbearing and familiar with death in a way that most of us are not, because we've got professionals in those industries that do the hard work for us. So I started thinking about, well, I now know, I didn't know until I became a police officer, what death looks like. There's a thing called the mortis triad. And the mortis triad exhibits certain features, 3 features. So the first thing that happens when your heart stops beating is that you start to cool down. That's called algor mortis. This is a cooling down of your body because the hot blood is not circulating anymore. You're cool to the touch. It's noticeably cool to the touch. If you're going to handle anyone for an extended period of time, you are going to notice that they are not their usual body temperature. So we're thinking, okay, I get it, but they wouldn't notice this? They take down a body that's passed out, just hoping he's not dead, making every effort, and they wouldn't notice that he's cool. I think if anyone wanted to think he was still alive, it would be this group. Yet he's showing signs of death. He's, I'm sure, cooler than a living person. The second thing that happens, you start to get stiff, and that's called rigor mortis, right? Sure. And they're not going to notice this. And the third thing that happens is the most decisive, and probably people think about it the least, and it's called liver mortis. What happens is when your heart stops pushing the blood, gravity works to draw the blood to whatever surface is lowest to gravity. If you died on your back and I get there and I roll you over, your back will now be red and purple and blue from the blood being drawn by gravity to the back. That bruising is called liver mortis. So you're going to see this in the feet of anyone who's suspended on a cross. Do we honestly think that these folks who were treating the body of Jesus, for the time it took to actually anoint the body, to wrap the body, to place it in the tomb, wouldn't notice those 3 features of death? I think it's easy for us to kind of make that claim in the 21st century because we don't even know what the signs of death are. But that's the generation that would have known. I think it's certainly possible. I always say, is it possible they missed it? Sure, but it's not reasonable. And the only thing I care about is what's reasonable. Possible doesn't matter. They're not trying to get you can never know anything beyond a possible doubt. I could always level some possible doubt. We're trying to get to beyond a reasonable doubt. The second thing, though, about that I thought was pretty convincing was this piece of hidden science in the Gospel of John. John's a fisherman. He writes a gospel. And
when you say hidden science, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, there's a piece of hidden science in a verse that describes that Jesus is hanging on the cross. He's next to the 2 thieves. The guards come by. They need to take the bodies off the cross. If they're not dead yet, they need to make sure they're dead. And they would typically do that by breaking the legs so you can't push up and catch a breath and you would suffocate, basically. Right. So the idea here is they get to these 3 bodies, they see the 2 are still alive, the thieves, they break their legs, but they don't break the legs of Jesus. Instead, they take a spear and they plunge it in his chest. And when they pull it out, they see a separation of blood and water. Interesting, he writes in his gospel that he saw water come out of the chest cavity of Jesus. Now that's interesting because I don't think anyone in that generation, or for several hundred years following that generation, understood why that water was there. As a matter of fact, if you read the church fathers, Tertullian, Origen, you read the church fathers in the first 300 or 400 years, none of them will describe that water as water. They'll try to make a metaphor, an allegory. It's got to be the Spirit of God. It's got to be a symbol of water baptism. It's got to be a symbol of regeneration. It can't be water because they don't understand the science of death. They just can't figure out why a spear, when pledged into his body, would actually produce water. Now, we know if you suffer cardiac arrest, if you're beaten the way that Jesus was beaten before he got to the cross, his path to the cross is different than the two thieves. If you're beaten like that and you go into cardiac arrest, or you go into shock first and then cardiac arrest, once that occurs and you've died of heart failure, you're going to suffer one of two forms of effusion that I have actually seen in autopsies. And the first is called pericardial effusion. It's where the water collects around your heart. But I've talked to coroners about this, even when I was seeing it in criminal work. That really never happens to the extent that you would see a separation of blood and water. But if you suffer what's called pleural effusion, of course you'd have to be in the right position. Then water begins to collect in your lungs. Now, he's suspended on a cross. Now, this would explain why when you shove the spear in his side, you would see the water as a product of pleural effusion come out of his chest cavity. But this is a sure sign of death that is missed by every early reader of Scripture who want to kind of spiritualize it. You know, it's a symbol of something. It couldn't be water. Well, what if John's just writing what he saw? He saw water. He's not trying to say, to draw an analogy. He's not trying to spiritualize this. He's just saying, hey, they stabbed him in the chest and they pulled this thing out, water comes out. Well, that makes sense. Now, unless you think that John is so clever that he decides to include this little-known fact that no one's going to know for centuries, knowing that when they finally figure it out, they'll say, wow, this is a really legitimate account. So I think that really the best explanation is he's just reporting what he saw, and what he saw is best explained by the fact that Jesus has already suffered heart failure and has now experienced pleural effusion. And I think that, for me, coupled with those signs of death that I think anyone would notice, I just had to cross out that explanation as unreasonable. And so I moved on from that explanation. And I think a lot of people, when you really kind of explain this and they think about it deeply, they're like, yeah. Also, you'd have a hard time explaining the post-resurrection accounts, because the kind of beating he took, you don't just bounce back from in 24 hours and all of a sudden you're dancing around and entering rooms miraculously and at the edge of a lake eating fish with your disciples. I mean, it's really hard, but forget about all that. For me, I just looked at it from the kinds of autopsies that I've been present at. I don't know if you realize this or not, but when there's a homicide in Los Angeles County, the investigator has to be present at the autopsy because they're not going to subpoena the coroner, they're going to subpoena me. And I have to be able to tell the jury, or tell, in this case, the prelim, the judge, what occurred at the autopsy. So if you've been to autopsies, you start to look and see death and understand what they surely would have seen. And that's why it was harder for me to believe they missed it. He was really alive, and they just missed it. So I just crossed that one out. And so then I was off and looking at the next possible explanation. So that's really how, though, for me, I moved beyond this possibility. And I think it's all it is. It's not a reasonable explanation, but it is a possible explanation. But I just I couldn't embrace it for me as a reasonable explanation.
So what was the next one? So you said, okay, that one's off the list, and very compelling arguments, based on your experience. What's the next one that would be an objection that you had to overcome?
Well, I mean, I think probably the most commonly, it's a lie. If it's a lie, we can explain why it's a lie. These guys came together and fabricated this story as a group for some purpose, perhaps to start a new world religion. You have to kind of understand what the purpose would be. It's, again, all motives come down to sex, power, or money. So what you kind of ask, well, what are you really after here? But aside from that, this idea is pretty oftenly trafficked that this is a conspiracy. And I think people in our culture love conspiracy theories. We love to write fiction about them, to make movies about this, to think in our imagination. But it's probably because we've never worked conspiracies. If you start to work conspiracies and try to unravel these to prosecute conspirators on a crime, you realize how difficult it is to pull off a conspiracy. It actually takes 5 things. If you have these 5 things, you can successfully conspire to commit a crime, to tell a lie. I think there are successful conspiracies. but they're difficult. And when they succeed, they have these 5 things in common. The question then becomes, well, are these 5 things present for the disciples to successfully pull? And when people tell me, they think, look, I can describe for you. I know there are some successful conspiracies. Oh, really? So you know some successful conspiracies? Oh, yeah. Well, then by definition, they weren't successful, right? Yeah. Because by definition, if you want to succeed in this, you've got to be able to get away with it and no one even know about it.
Right.
That's why they're so, the fact that we know about so many conspiracies just proves my point.
Right.
You got to have these 5 things. Number 1, smallest possible number of co-conspirators. Mm-hmm. Again, this is not rocket surgery, right? I always mix that metaphor. But the point is, it really is just straightforward thinking. 2 people can lie, keep a secret, better than 22, 222. So if you think a large number of people are conspiring to keep a secret, think twice about it because it's really hard.
Right.
Also, keep it for the shortest possible amount of time. So a great conspiracy is where 2 people go out and do a crime together and then immediately one kills the other. Great conspiracy. Probably going to get away with it because you've only had to hold it for 1 day and you only had 2 to begin with. Now you have none, just 1. That's a good conspiracy. Third thing people don't think about is excellent communication between co-conspirators, because at some point, someone's going to get stopped and forced to make a statement. And then we're going to separate those folks and talk to the other guy.
Right.
And by the way, we're going to get into the weeds in terms of questions. We're not just going to do the surface stuff. We're going to go think about all kinds of crazy things that I'm sure you haven't thought about beforehand when you're getting your stories together. So your stories have to match. You have to be able to call and say, hey, what did he ask you? And what did you say? So you can actually say the same things. Or what shouldn't I say? You know, don't let them go in this direction. Okay, fine. But if you don't have great communication, it's hard. Right. The fourth thing is if you've got a family relationship or some bond that is, you have a familial relationship with somebody, you usually get away with things. I mean, moms, for example, are not going to rat off their kids because they have a familial relationship. So if you've got that that helps. And then the last thing is no pressure. If you've got no pressure, it's easy to get away with a lie. It's harder when people are pressuring you. So I'm looking at these 5 things that are required, and I'm asking myself, do any of these, exist for the disciples? We've got a group that is large, way too large. It's not just James, John, and Peter. It's the 12 at least. There's always a group of disciples. We have no idea, for example, how many disciples are in some of these accounts we have that saw the resurrection. We know this. Paul says at one time there were 500 people who saw the risen Christ together on the same day, and he challenges the Corinthians to go out and actually talk to those people. He says, because most of them are still alive and available for you to talk to. So that's a large group. You're suggesting there's 500 people involved in a conspiracy? I'm already skeptical. Right. I'll just be honest with you. To me, that's already way too many people. But then you got to hold it for the shortest period of time. And we're talking about not 6 minutes, that would be easy, or 6 hours, or 6 days, or 6 weeks, or 6 months, or 6 years. We're talking about 6 decades. 500 plus people are going to hold this tight without anyone ever recanting or changing their story for 6 decades. Okay. Okay. It's possible, but is it reasonable? Also, do they have any family ties? Well, there were some brothers in that first set of disciples, right? You have Peter and Andrew, you've got James and John, but you've got a lot of people who had no connection to the story aside from having seen it, like Matthew. What is in it for Matthew? He's not related to anyone. He wasn't even associated. He was Levi collecting taxes when he was entered into the group. He wasn't part of the discipleship of John the Baptist, not part of the discipleship of Jesus, yet he's writing a gospel. He doesn't flinch. Fourth thing, you gotta have great communication between co-conspirators. Really? Okay, you can't Snapchat each other, and they're not together. Right. They're all over the empire. You got some in India, Thomas. You got North Africa, Matthew. You've got Italy and Asia Minor and in Jerusalem. They're separated, and they're being pressured. That's the last thing is pressure. They're being tortured, yet no one recants. I mean, is it possible? It's a lie. Of course it's possible. It's just not reasonable. And so I couldn't hold on to that, having worked conspiracies. Because what we'll do is we will unwrap the conspiracy. We will separate people immediately because we're going to defeat their ability to communicate. We'll do all of these things. And I've done it over and over and over again. And as you do this, you realize, okay, yeah, it's possible, but man, it's not reasonable. And to me, this is far too long. Far too many people under far too much pressure. So I'm back to that same point where I've got a possible explanation, but it's not a reasonable explanation. Right. So off to the next explanation. And I just keep doing this, right? We can go one more step. Let's just go one more step for the sake of argument.
Good.
I think the top 3 explanations that are typically offered for the Gospels are, for the resurrection account, from an atheistic perspective, didn't really die, or this is a lie, or 3, they imagined it. Because they wanted it. I mean, they clearly wanted it. And nobody wanted it in this group wanted to see Jesus die. They could have honestly just imagined it because they were so desperately wanting it to be true. You got Mary, she's by herself in the garden tomb. She sees the gardener. Oh, it's Jesus. No, Mary, it's the gardener. You imagine it to be Jesus because you so desperately want it. And you're by yourself. So, I can see why you might imagine that. And we've got an account of Peter by himself. We've got an account of James by himself. We've got an account of Paul on the road to Damascus. He's the only one who sees the figure of Jesus standing on the road to Damascus. Okay, well, I started having problems as I was assessing these, though, because I could see why maybe Peter or James or Mary would want to see Jesus alive, but why would Paul want Jesus to be alive? So now we're starting to, I think the idea that it's just a vision on the part of people who wanted it to be so becomes harder for me when it gets to Paul. And then you have a bigger problem, because then you have multiple eyewitnesses who see the same thing and report it for years to come. It makes it into the Gospels. For example, the people on the road to Emmaus, they see Jesus. There's more than one person there. There's 2 at least. Now, and that's tricky, right? Because if I told you I had a dream last night and you were able to recount the details of my dream, that would freak me out, right? Because we don't have group dreams.
Right.
If we have a group anything, it's going to be a group memory.
Right.
So now we have group accounts. We have 3 women at the tomb. We have 7 at the lake who see Jesus at the same time. We have 10 in the upper room. No Judas, no Thomas. Then we have Thomas return. We have 11. Then we have 11 again at the mountaintop. Could be more there. We have the ascension of Jesus. Could be more. We have 500 all together at one time, according to Paul. Really? So they're imagining this? These are group imaginations? And again, you could very easily falsify this. Just run back to the tomb. If you're imagining this, there should be a body in the tomb. Oh, no body in the tomb. Well, what's that about? Or back to conspiracy theory? I mean, you see how everything kind of devolves back to some kind of conspiracy. Right. So again, these are I can see why we would want to offer these alternatives, because they kind of get us up from the burden of having to consider Jesus the way that Christianity wants us to consider him. But at the same time, I look at that and I think, okay, well, these are all possible explanations that really, when push comes to shove, they don't work, which is why we see so many people offer new possibilities. Why do we have 6 or 7 explanations for this? Because everyone knows they don't work. Right. And they keep on offering a new one, hoping the one will stick to the wall. And it doesn't really work that way. It turns out there is one explanation, but boy, you'd have to surrender your naturalism. You'd have to surrender, and honestly, anyone who thinks seriously about their position already will have to admit there are some places in their own understanding of the universe where they've already surrendered their naturalism. They already know there has to be something more, something that starts all of this that can't be space, time, or matter. We already, if you think carefully, you already have. The only question left is that first cause personal? Or is the first cause an impersonal force? And that's where I got. At the end of all this, the only difference between Jim the atheist and Jim the believer was that Jim the atheist believed there was a cause that started the universe. That cause itself was uncaused, but that cause was an impersonal force. Something we don't quite understand yet. We will someday. And that impersonal force kickstarts everything in the universe. Now, as a believer on this side, I still believe in that force. But that force is not impersonal, because it turns out the best explanation for moral obligations, for the intelligent information we see in DNA, for the appearance of design we see in biology, for the fine-tuning of the universe, these things require a personal agent. That would be, now, we're in the same place. Something started the universe, but it seems to me that the personal agent could explain all the other stuff we see in the universe, whereas the impersonal force doesn't quite get it done. And so I realized, hey, again, I'm back to that same place. If there's a personal agent that could do all of this, that's pretty powerful. Right. Probably could rise from the grave. Probably could walk on water. Probably could feed 5,000. Suddenly, all of that stuff seemed like child's play. and I was able to assess it in a different way. You know, when you work a crime scene, you typically get an idea, a view of who your suspect is before you really ever meet that person. Because there's the stuff in the scene is accountable. I mean, you're going to basically attribute this stuff to your suspect. Or if it's not to your suspect, other people who have been in the scene. But if you can isolate the stuff that's in the scene, that you know your suspect deposited there, it's going to tell you something. Even where the crime occurred is going to, because some people would maybe not know how to get here to this location to do the crime here. So you can actually start to narrow down and do what we call a suspect profile. And basically all we're doing is we're saying, okay, given the that piece of evidence, the only way that could get there is if that person who did this is like X. And that piece of evidence, he must or she must also be like Y. Because you're starting to shape together what kind of person could account for the stuff we're seeing in the scene. And so at some point, that's something that I had to do also, right? I just needed to know, I had stuff I thought was in the universe that had to be explained. I've already described some of that, right? The beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the appearance of life in the universe, the appearance of design and biology, consciousness, free agency, morality, objective moral truths, and even evil has to be accounted for. But you have to have a standard. So what we're really looking for is what is the standard by which we call something evil? Okay. That stuff has to be in the universe. It has to be explained. And whatever explains it, if it's one suspect that can explain all of it, that's going to give us a pretty robust picture. We're looking for something. This is why I thought that a personal agent was the best explanation for the beginning. We're looking for something that is powerful enough to blink everything into existence from nothing, and is therefore not part of the something that is creating. It's not spatial, temporal, or material. It's uncaused. And by the way, everyone's looking for the uncaused first cause, not just the theist. If you think it's a multiverse generator that's created the universes, and ours is one of those, well, that you probably believe that multiverse generator is uncaused. So to ask who created your creator is no better than saying, well, what caused your uncaused multiverse generator? We're all in that same boat. So we're looking for something uncaused that's non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material, but also is concerned about an end goal and has therefore fine-tuned the universe in just a certain way that allows for life to emerge. It doesn't have to be this way. So we're looking for something that seems to be purposeful and has the ability to fine-tune the elements and the conditions in such a way. We're also looking for something that accounts for the origin of life. And the most key ingredient about that, of course, is the genetic code. We see information in the genetic code. We have no way to explain information by our common experience or by any scientific process from purely physics. You can get some kind of information from physics and chemistry, but you can't get the kind of information we see in DNA. That's a very high level of information, and we only in our common experience can attribute that to intelligence. But that would mean the ability to decide between all. We're looking at a personal, intelligent being because that agent is deciding between alternatives. That's what information is. It's the selection between alternatives. Then you're looking for the appearance of design. Well, now we're looking for something that actually has the ability to design. And we typically, the ID movement banks on this idea that there's an intelligent designer. So now we're looking for 4 characteristics. Plus, it appears to be a mind that is creating in its own image, which is why we can account for something more than our brain. We account for our immaterial consciousness. If there's a conscious being that is designing in its image, that might explain why we have consciousness. And we have free agency. We're sitting here thinking about this right now. It's not predestined for us to conclude our conclusions. We actually can change our mind, but you can't change your brain. That would be a series of events that are entirely physical. You can't control. You arrive at this conclusion because your neurons have fired in this way, and that started at the beginning of the universe, and all those dominoes have been falling in a certain way all that time, and you don't even have free agency. And that's why people who are consistent, like Sam Harris, a consistent atheist who's a neuroscientist, he denies free agency of this kind because he knows that you have to be a series of physical events in your brain. But we seem to experience free agency. If there's a mind that can choose freely and design what we see in biology and creates in its image, we might also possess minds that can choose freely. Again, we have a better explanation. And there's last 2 things, objective moral truths. Well, we believe there are some objective moral. It's never okay to torture babies for fun. That's an objective claim that doesn't change no matter where you are in history or where you are on the planet. If there's a Star Trek universe, it's not okay to torture Klingon babies for fun. This is an objective, transcendent moral obligation. We know that all obligations are between persons. So now we're looking for the source that is an objective, transcendent moral person. Again, a better explanation is personal rather than impersonal. And finally, we're looking for a standard of good by which we could all agree that when we see the shadow from the sunlight, that's evil. You got to have that standard of sunlight that we all agree on. And so again, we're looking for a source, an objective source of good. And I think that Dawkins says it best when he says that if the universe is simply a collection of physical processes, there is no good or evil, just blind, pitiless indifference. Yet we think there is good and evil. How do you ground that? So I looked at that entire collection of evidences and realizing I need a non-spatial, non-material, non-temporal being that could fine-tune and was intelligent enough to provide information in DNA and could design as a designer and has a conscious mind that can choose freely and has got the source of all moral standards, including the standard of righteousness that by which we call anything evil. Well, what am I looking at here? Isn't that the classic definition that we have been using for God for eons? Yes. So I realized the best explanation. Now, of course, that doesn't mean Christianity is true. And that's why I spent so much time on the resurrection. Because if we're looking for the one system that actually gives us a picture of that God, if Jesus rose from the grave, that would change everything. I have a tendency to believe people who rise from the grave. So I think I was stuck with the narrative that Jesus provided because he demonstrated his authority from the resurrection. And that's where I ended up saying, okay, it's time to make a decision.
So, and this is, again, I mentioned this earlier, but I think it bears mentioning again here. It's not like saying, hey, I kind of just feel this in my heart, therefore I'm following this path.
Yeah.
It's really quite the opposite of that. But what I find fascinating is that culturally, and I wonder if you had the same context before you became a Christian, it's the idea that people who would adopt this faith, who would become Christians, are people who had to subjugate their rational faculties to a feeling they have inside.
Yeah.
In your case, you keep coming at it by a chain of logic that says that this is the best explanation for all of this stuff.
You know, I do envy, though, people who are not always wrestling with these ideas. Mm-hmm. You know, there are people I know who have been Christians for as long as they can remember, and they are true Christian brothers and sisters who love God, love Jesus, are saved, and have experiences of their faith that I envy. Because for me, it's just the copy of me that always says, really? You know, because if you believe everybody, if you believe every feeling that's out there, no one goes to jail. You just bump around from one feeling to another. It's doubting everyone. It's doubting everything that's ever said to you that eventually ends up in someone going to jail. It's suspicion, constantly being suspicious, never just allowing yourself to feel that stuff. And that's why a lot of the cops you meet who've been doing this for 25 years, it can hurt you, it can change you. So I didn't know any other way to believe this or anything else. I couldn't feel my way into this because that's just not what we do. And I have no interest in that. I often say I'm not a Christian because it works for me. Because I'll be honest, it doesn't work for me. I don't think it works for anybody really if they would really analyze it. Is this the easiest life you could ever live? No. It's easy to throw the dart on the wall and just draw the bullseye around wherever the dart lands, okay? It's much harder to have the bullseye there first. And for the years that I was not a Christian, I was the only God that Jim ever had. So if you asked Jim, how's your day going? How's your year? It's great. Well, by whose standard? By mine. I'm the only standard I have to meet. Right. You know, it's hard to be a hypocrite when no one really knows your fuzzy standard that always moves back and forth because your standard is you. It's easy to call out the hypocrite when the standard is incredibly high and public. So I would expect everyone who is a Christian to eventually be called out as a hypocrite. Well, first of all, we're all hypocrites, but no one is as public a hypocrite as the Christian because everyone knows our standard. It's this Jesus of Nazareth standard. Oh my gosh, forget about it. I'm always going to fail according to that standard. I can't even hold up. I disagree with myself half the time. How am I going to hold up to that standard? But I think that the years before I was a Christian were in some ways easier years to live, more convenient years to live. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to put myself last. I was always in the first position. It was all about me. Now I'm called to something different, the more difficult life. The life that says that stuff doesn't matter. The stuff that we're kind of told by the culture we should chase, the stuff we should chase, careers, houses, properties, the perfect relationships. These are things now that have been put on their ear, have been turned upside down. now I see the proper role. What am I called to be? Who am I called to be? What really matters? Do you have a temporary perspective that talks about how good will this year be? Or do I have an eternal perspective that really measures things in light of eternity? It's a very different way to live. And I think it's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And it's difficult. So it doesn't always work. If what you mean by work is that you're going to have your best life now. You're going to have you're going to have the best year you could possibly have. Well, this is not what Jesus called us to. You see it all the time in Scripture. Hey, they're already coming after me, guys. You're next. They're going to come after you too. You got to pick this cross and carry it. It's going to be the same for all of you. This is not an easy life. Get ready to lose it all. And unless you're willing to say, I will lose it all, you can't be part of this, because you'll always be holding on to something you're going to call God instead of God. And so I realized I'm not a Christian because it works in that sense, or because I was raised in a Christian family, because I wasn't, or because I really was hoping for heaven, or afraid of hell, because those things just don't animate me, or because I had this train wreck I was trying to correct, to get back on the rails, because I didn't have a bad, I had a great life before. I actually think that in some ways this is harder, because the stuff I used to celebrate, once I realized that God existed and that Jesus did this for me, I now sometimes still struggle with sin, still struggle with my sinful nature. The only difference is that now I wrestle with it, because I know the Spirit is kind of woken up. We talk about being woke. I'm woke in the sense that I know what is right and wrong. And way before, I defined right and wrong before. Now I realize that's not my definition. It's harder to live this life, especially in a culture that is more and more hostile toward the teaching of Jesus. And the true fact is, it's not going to get any better. People will say, oh, I don't mind Jesus. It's Christians, or it's Christianity. Well, okay. You can't love Jesus and hate his teaching. And what we have right now is a culture that sometimes says they love Jesus, but not all of his teaching. Well, if we're going to be faithful, and what helps me to be faithful is knowing that it's true. Let me put it to you this way, I think it's clear. I had a case years ago where a guy was in a bulletproof vest. We all wear bulletproof vests. We know they stop bullets because we've seen them stop bullets in the range. So we wear these in every shift under our shirts. And one day he pulls over this drunk driver, and the drunk driver gets out of the car, and the drunk driver had a gun in his waistband, and the officer didn't know it, and the drunk driver decided that day he was going to kill the officer. So he pulled his gun out, and he pointed it at the officer. And the officer was just far enough away, he couldn't do a gun takeaway, he couldn't do anything. He stood there, and he told me afterwards, because I'm working officer-involved shootings at the time, he told me afterwards, I didn't know what to do. I thought about a couple of options in that split second. I could duck behind the car, I could hit the deck, I could just charge him. But I decided instead, because I knew I was wearing my vest, just to take the first couple of rounds and get my own gun out and get involved in the gunfight. And I thought when I heard that story, wow, that's a guy who doesn't just have belief that, he has belief in, because he's about to trust that vest to do what he knows it can do. And the only reason why he's doing that, I think, is because, like me, he has seen that vest stop bullets. So why do I continue to take this approach toward my Christian faith? Because if you know the vest can stop bullets, can answer every objection, you're far more likely to stand calmly in the battle. And what's really great about it is, it affects your character. So you ever notice how Chihuahuas are really noisy? Yeah. They're constantly barking. You get them in a yard full of dogs, they think they have to constantly puff up and be the big dog in the yard because they're so small, right? Meanwhile, a Great Dane walks in the yard, doesn't make a noise, just walks and he owns the yard from the time he steps in. Well, what happens if we don't see Christianity as the big worldview that can hold up to the battle, we're going to be like Chihuahuas, always barking, always hoping that somebody will think that we're bigger than we are. If we saw that this thing can stop bullets, that in that gunfight, we're just going to stand still and be calm. I don't need to overreact. He didn't overreact. He didn't panic. He just said, okay, tonight I'm trusting the vest. And he only got there because he had good evidence to support his belief that the vest would stop bullets. So I think that's what I really hope that all of us, as we kind of examine evidence, that we, number one, have more confidence, two, allow it to change our character in the challenge, and three, we have moved from belief that to believe in.
So you said earlier you almost wish that you could accept things from the way you feel from the more emotional perspective. Do you ever have concerns that you might somehow think toward a path that might move you away from where you are right now?
Well, this is something that's kind of there's a theological argument about this, right? I mean, what is really happening here? What I believe happened for me was that I had an enmity toward God. Mm-hmm. And God's Spirit, He removed that enmity from me. And that's when I could actually assess the evidence fairly. I never would have given it a fair shake. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't on my own intellectual prowess that I said, oh, today I'm going to assess the evidence fair. No, it's that God did something that I could not do for myself first. And that's what opened the door. The evidence is not, it's just a means to an end. It's a means that God used to that end, but it was God who did it. I was being prayed for years. And I know that people like me, my dad is like me, and he is not a believer. I am not going to talk him into this. Right. But I can pray him into it, because at some point, if I pray him into that position where he's receptive, that's something I can do. I cannot do that. I cannot get him to be receptive, but God can do that. I simply have to be asking God to do it. And while I'm asking, I'm going to be modeling Christ for him. But at some point, when he moves into that position where he has ears to hear, I can't make him have ears to hear. Mm-hmm. God does that. But then I can voice the case I just explained for you and for myself. And at that point, I do believe he will hear it, because he cannot resist this force of God acting in his own life. Mm-hmm. But again, that's not that the evidence has this mystical power. Right. It's the same evidence that people have been looking at for 2,000 years. It's that God has to first do something to make us receptive.
So your passion, your focus, your energy now is really in a highly charged, I mean, it's in a positive way, state.
Right, right.
What do you feel like you're at your best when you are being a pastor, when you are sharing the message? When do you feel like you're at your best?
I think everyone's shaped so differently, right? And people will say to me, well, I don't have that gift. Mm-hmm. I don't have a lot of gifts either. I mean, I know what my gifts are and what they aren't. I pastored for a number of years, but I think I'm probably more of a teacher than a pastor. I think pastors are incredibly special and highly underappreciated. So I have a great respect for pastors. It's a hard job, and those who do it well are just amazing, okay? So I just have learned that I have these limited things I can bring to the table. But that's not unlike all of us. Mm-hmm. All of us have something that we have. Who would have thought that my background I was a designer. Mm-hmm. And I never would have guessed, as a designer as a kid and through undergraduate school, then I became an architect. Mm-hmm. And I went to grad school for architecture. You wouldn't have told me the year I was entering my master's program for architecture, hey, Jim, someday you're going to be a cop. Okay? I didn't see that coming. But it turns out I used a lot of that design process, that interest in the arts, to communicate cases to juries. So it turns out that those gifts that I developed early on were not lost in my 5 years working in law enforcement. But who would have guessed, if you'd have caught me 5 years into my law enforcement career and said, hey, someday you're going to be a believer, I'd have said, no way. Everyone who knew me would have said no way, but here we are years later. Both the design gifts, hopefully, and the law enforcement gifts are being used in this stage of life. Well, all of us are at some point in our lives where the gifts are being assembled so we can use them to do this work. And I'm not a PhD, but I'll tell you something, and people who kind of experience Christ and who are believers, we have a tendency to think, well, I can't do that, Jim, because I don't have a PhD. I don't have a background in neuroscience. I don't have a background in cosmology. I don't have a background in biology. Clearly, I don't either. But it turns out that the people who get to vote in jury trials are not the expert witnesses. They're the lay people we put in the box. As a matter of fact, if I knew you were an expert, I wouldn't put you in that box. Why? Because you will allow your expertise to cloud your thinking. You probably can't be told very much. I need you to openly assess what the experts are saying. And if you are an expert, you may not be so fair to those experts. Number two, you'll notice that when I call an expert to trial, he is testifying about a piece of evidence. Well, the next defense attorney does not bring in a bunch of new evidence. No, typically the defense attorney uses the same evidence that I brought in. He just calls a new PhD who says the exact opposite thing of this PhD. So now you have the same piece of evidence, two very good, honest people, honest PhD professionals, and I have great respect for the expert witnesses we call, but they clearly don't agree on this piece of evidence. Right. Who gets to decide which of these two PhDs is actually telling the truth?
A non-PhD.
Layperson.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So in the end, I think we're in a great position, and don't be inhibited by the fact, we can't be inhibited by the fact that I'm going to read like crazy. I wrote a book called God's Crime Scene. I read 132 books of all the skeptics before I began writing that book. You got to read. But in the end, don't underestimate the power of a layperson to assess a case. We use it all the time.
So you've got some decades on this planet, and you're doing the work you're doing now. Mm-hmm. Do you think that right now that Christianity is more under attack than it has been in the past, say, 20 or 30 years, or do you feel like it's being embraced more?
Well, I think we have to be careful when we use the word attack, right? Because every time you talk about, well, is Christianity under attack, I think it's fair for people to say, come, give me a break. You want to see where Christianity is under attack? It's not in America. We have people being crucified still in other places on the planet. That's where Christianity is truly under attack, and I get that. Right. But I think what I do see in our culture is that it's waning in its influence in culture. At least we can agree on that.
Yes.
Now, whether we agree there's this overt, concerted, kind of coordinated attack on Christianity, I think that would be overstating it for sure. But what I do see is that there are wedge issues, right? It's the moral teaching of Jesus that's going to become, the moral teaching of the New Testament, that's going to become more and more unpopular. And there's only going to be a couple of ways to respond to this. Mm-hmm. One, we can say nothing and kind of hope that it kind of goes by, just stay silent, don't even talk about those issues. Two, we could just acquiesce to everything and decide that whatever we know is true from the teaching of Scripture and we've affirmed for 2,000 years, we're now going to abandon in light of a new sexual revolution that we're experiencing. Or three, we can be faithful in what's going to feel at times like a loss. We can be faithful in what feels at times like there's no way we can win this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably where we need to be. Regardless of what happens, the measurement cannot be, well, can we elect so-and-so? Really? That can't be the measure. The measurement's going to have to be, can we remain faithful in our families and in our communities in spite of the fact that the very core beliefs we hold are going to be less and less popular. And they were not popular to begin with. They weren't popular in the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. And Jesus talks about this. So I think we've got good teaching in Scripture that can help us. What's happened, I think, for the most part, is that many of us have been raised in a Christian culture that accommodated Christianity quite nicely for a number of years, and we got soft. Mm-hmm. We got comfortable. We got it kind of where the majority of people would believe this worldview is true. That's going to shrink. Mm-hmm. And I was not one of those people who believed it was true. So I'm okay with, I'm comfortable with the idea that this is going to become, God's going to do what God's going to do. Mm-hmm. And the reality of it is I think we have to be more and more comfortable with discomfort.
So are you seeing in the colleges or in the younger generation that there's more fall off or that there's this sort of uncoolness to be a Christian?
Yeah, what you see is there's a movement, we've been studying it for years, kind of Pew has been reporting on this also, of people who would have in the past claimed an affiliation with a particular religious belief, who now when polled, well, they'll say, no, I have no religious belief. They'll check the box that says nuns. We see it's called the rise of the nuns, the growth of the nuns. That group is growing. It's in the low 20s right now, percentage-wise. And it seems that as it grows by 1% or so a year, it is coming off the number of people who previously called themselves Christians. I don't know that this necessarily means that Christians are leaving, although we do see that young Christians are far more likely to either, number one, hold a view that's really not Christian, they don't even understand that it's not Christian, or two, walk away from the church altogether. I think we see that statistically true. But the real question is, do we really have, how can I say this, if we had a big pot, and those were all the people that called themselves Christians, but in that pot we had a little cup, and in that little cup were people who not only called themselves Christians, but actually understood what Christianity teaches. Right. That group would have been much smaller. This larger group said, yeah, I'm a Christian, but what does that really mean? Well, I really can't tell you what that, they just kind of are cultural Christians. They were kind of raised in this system, but don't really even understand the core teaching of Christianity. That group is much smaller. Now, that group that was in that big pot in the past, I think was comfortable being in that pot. But as things have kind of tightened down a little bit in the culture and it's shifting away from Christianity, those people are jumping out of the big pot into the main, to the larger environment. I don't know that the cup is shrinking at all. The pot is shrinking. Yeah. But the cup may not be shrinking. Right. And if we stop and think about it, well, in this big pot before, who were the real Christians? Were everyone in the pot? Or just the folks who were in the cup? Probably just the folks who are in the cup. So while the pot is shrinking, I'm not sure the cup is. Right. So I think there's hope for us to know that maybe nothing has really changed in terms of those people who actually understood what Jesus taught and embraced what Jesus taught. The people who really believe this were probably, that number may not be shrinking at all. I think the future will certainly show that to us. But here's what I do know. There are an entire group of people now who would say they have no religious affiliation. And that group is not claiming to be atheist or agnostic. That's a box they could check. They're not checking that box. They're just saying, I'm not over here anymore. That is a mission field. Those are people who can be reached with the truth, because they are not saying, I'm against it. They're saying, and they're not saying it's they're for that. They're saying, I'm just no longer part of that pot. Well, it's time for us to get serious and grow the size of the cup. And if nothing else, I hope the work that we do in thinking, number one, we're called to do this. We're called to worship God with both our heart and with our mind.
Yes.
All of it. It's a holistic approach. And a lot of us have not really been thinking much about what we believe. And I think the acts that we actually spend, the time we spend thinking about this and talking about it, look, this is an act of worship. This is when you spend your time on this is an act of, you got to sing in order to worship? You got to pray in order? No. This is an act of worship. It's talking about this. We're worshiping God with our mind. And I think when we do that and we grow, we're going to grow that cup. People who are able to worship God with their minds. And that's really, I think, the goal of my personal mission, is to have people shift from what's either an unreasonable faith or a blind faith to what I would call a forensic faith, a faith that, number one, is reasonable, is biblical, and can withstand the pressures of culture. So
then you could segue into my final question. So for the next, say, 10 years of your activities, your work, your effort, your purpose, what is it going to be directed toward?
When you look like this and you're an old guy, it's probably going to be in the context of being an older guy. And I think what that, for me, when I was a youth pastor, I became a believer, and then, within 8 or 10 years I was youth pastoring, and I loved it. My kids, of course, were the age of my youth group, so I had my own children as part of that. And I realized as a youth pastor that I was not going to be the cool 28-year-old youth pastor who will go surfing with you and wakeboarding with you and snowboarding with you. That's not who I was. I was 40. I was already too old to do those kinds of things, and at least I wasn't interested in those kinds of things. I was a cop. I was working full-time as a detective. And I realized that I wasn't going to be able to connect with high schoolers on the basis of my coolness. Instead, I connected to high schoolers on the basis of my paternal relationship with them. And I had worked years in gangs where I saw what lack of dad led to. Because all the gangsters I worked, regardless of what they were racially, economically, socially, they all had one thing in common: lack of dad. It looks different. Sometimes dad's a workaholic. Sometimes dad is in custody. Sometimes dad's just a deadbeat who never shows up. Lack of dad looks different. And I realized that working in youth pastorate that you can fill that gap, that every one of us can take that step and fill in where somebody else has dropped the ball. And so I think the experience I had in youth pastoring was that I wanted to step in and be that paternal role model, or that paternal relationship. You don't come to me for cool, you're not going to get that from me. You already know that. You're going to get dad from me. But for a lot of young men and women, dad is, it's related to lower criminal activity. If you've got dad is present, lower rates of teenage pregnancy. If dad is present, you can go on and on. Higher educational levels of dad is present, less poverty if dad is present. All these things are related to lack of dad. So I think in the next 10 years, we've written adult books, and now my wife and I are writing children's books, and then we'll be doing high school books. I think we're going to spend time investing in the lives of young people. Really not from the cool factor, but just because we are parents who care about kids. And even though our kids are grown right now, I think it's important. By the way, you remember when our kids were young, we would do anything that was in the best interest of our kids. So you pick a restaurant, it's not the one you want to eat at. No, it's the one your kids will eat at, right? You pick a movie, it's not the one you want to see, it's the one your kids want to see. Oh, you pick a vacation, it's not your destination, it's the one that's good for the kids. Well, now we are a family called the church. And we've got kids. They may not be our kids, but they're kids. I think every decision we make as a group going forward ought to be through the lens of we're raising kids. Oh, you don't like that kind of music? We're raising kids. Oh, you don't like that kind of thing, that kind of retreat? We're raising kids. Oh, you don't like that kind of calendar? We're raising kids. And if we would do that, we would raise up a next generation that would be amazingly committed and wouldn't suffer from all the lack of parenting that I think in some ways the disintegration of family that is the problem at its core. And we could actually address that from a Christian worldview that calls us to family. So I think the next, for us, 10 years will be trying to do what we can to strengthen family.
Well, I wish you very well with that, and I think you'll probably be very successful in what you're trying to achieve. Thanks so much. I mean, your context is so unique, and I think really kind of thrilling. It's an intellectual thrill ride, the way that you approach and describe this, and your passion and energy is contagious, and I very much appreciate you spending time here with us today.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate it.